Welcome to our discussion tonight on the ego of activism, where we'll be focusing on cancel culture and polarization. I'm Ronan Harrrington, and I'll be joined by Bayo Akomolafe. Bayo is a speaker, author, and writer. He really is a voice that is bringing an entirely different frame to the political debate, one based on a new ontology and epistemology about the world. And one that is replete with wisdom and depth and love. And so I'm really interested to talk to him tonight about what that kind of perspective can bring to what seems to be a very stuck debate. Before we hear from Bayo, I want to just say some words of context. The Ego of Activism series is an attempt to really get to grips with the psyche that animates activism. We are living in a time where issues like climate change and inequality and systemic oppression and racism feel more urgent than ever. And at the same time, there's a mainstream backlash and alienation from activism. And I think we're moving from a dismissal of that to say, well, that's just, cognitive dissonance, or people just don't want to, hear uncomfortable truths, to actually seeing that there are aspects of our own movement that are problematic and actually need our attention. And so the ego of activism is moving from this frame of the problem is with people out there to actually how do we need to hold a mirror to ourselves. And it feels like nowhere is this more potent at the moment than with cancel culture, where there is a real societal antagonism and rejection of the methods of cancel culture. We've seen, for the last couple of years, the rumblings of identity politics and woke activism really metastasize into something that is has elements that we really need to understand. So some of the cultural flashpoints have, of course, been Black Lives Matters and the mainstreaming of white supremacy, white fragility narrative. We've had J.K. Rowling's comments on transgender and the backlash against that. We've had the New York Times debacle and the battle between Generation X liberals and more Generation Y woke radicals, and hundreds of examples of people who have been dismissed or shamed publicly for saying the wrong thing. And tonight isn't going to be a night where we're just critical of identity politics or woke activism. I think it's really important to validate the valid, to say that it ultimately does come from a well-intentioned place of really saying no to speech and to action that is either directly harmful in the context of hate speech or indirectly harmful in terms of creating a climate that is more phobic and more intolerant. And that, even though there is a real intensity to this form of activism at the moment, it does come from a place of people feeling that fascism, particularly in America, is on the rise, and that intolerance is becoming more normalized. So there's a kind of a need to up the ante. And that actually all the critiques of cancel culture, when you look at the specific cases, are actually quite valid and defensible. And they're really just taking issue with a kind of a bogeyman or a kind of a phenomena in the abstract that actually, when you get down to specific cases, just doesn't wash. And so I want to hold, the feeling from activist supporters that we're too concerned with this micro-fascism and not enough with the macro-fascism of actually, in Portland at the moment, there being protests and Trump sending in Homeland Security, bundling people into unmarked vans, and to have some perspective on the debate. And at the same time, there are aspects to cancel culture, its contribution to polarization, that we need to wrestle with and contend with. And we're very lucky to have Bayo tonight to join us in the discussion of that. So Bayo, I'll hand it over to you. I'd love to just get some opening thoughts from you about what sense you're making of this moment and how you relate to cancel culture.
Well, the first thing that I'm feeling at this moment is such a deep love and appreciation for you and your courage to speak and to hold spaces like this where we can meet each other in the fragility of the moment. So thank you. Thank you for opening up the space. And my brother behind the beautiful screen, the Psychedelic Society screen there, Richard, thank you for holding space as well. Yoruba people, where I come from, like to give expressions of gratitude. So I'm also thanking everyone that is showing up, making and convening this space together with us. Well, I'm not sure exactly where to dive in. This is a caveat statement that I'm no expert on the nuances of cancel culture. I'm not sure they're experts yet. I'm not sure it's a discipline yet that has proliferated expertise. I'm more of a generalist. That's my expertise. Um, but I think my stupidity might be emancipatory, or might just open up new spaces of thinking about this phenomenon, this modern phenomenon. Yeah, and I feel very welcome to do that. How would you like us to dive in together?
I would like to. I would like to ask you a personal question,
Okay.
more of an abstract question. My personal question is: do you feel the phenomenon of cancel culture, or the fear of really being honest and speaking your mind, in the current climate, as a writer, as a thinker, particularly in relation to critiques of the progressive movement?
Right.
And following that, I would like to know, just, there's a lot of critiques of woke activism and cancel culture. And it's very rare that we hear a kind of a reflexive critique from inside the movement. And I'd love to know what you think in relation to that.
Okay. Well, thank you, brother. I'm not American or European. I'm fortunately and maybe strategically positioned outside of the epicenter of this conversation. Coming from Nigeria and living in the so-called global South as I do, different ethical considerations are at work that are not centralizing the issues around cancel culture. I have found myself in the compost heap of conversations about or around cultural appropriation, not on the receiving end of that, but those around me working closely with me have been accused of, taking parts of my culture, for instance, and using it to their own ends. And my response is always one of surprise, because I would come in and then realize that that's happening, and then actually invite people to notice that the Yoruba people would actually celebrate this moment that has been termed cultural appropriation by people in the West, that we would actually like, yes, you're wearing our dress, take it, dance with it, do whatever you want with it. Let's give this guy a name. It's different ethical considerations are at work here. And I think that maybe that's the gift of this moment, to see from a so-called external point of view what might be liberating or liberatory about this space. I feel that your second question is about what I feel we can give attention to as people within progressive movements, woke culture, the activisms of today. Have you read Chinua Achebe's work, Things Fall Apart, Ronan? I wonder if anyone here has read it. Premier African novelist. I'm not about to spoil it for you, because that's another thing that I might get accused of doing. But the final part of this book that came out I think in the 40s or 50s, ends with the protagonist, Okonkwo, a wrestler, hanging himself. And he hangs himself to protest colonization, basically. He hangs himself from a tree, which is a curse in that community. You don't just take yourself. You're not allowed back into the ground. And he hangs himself as a figure of dissociation as well, as a warning to his community, which is rapidly embracing the ethics and the morality and the practices of the colonizers. You're getting woke and you're becoming developed. And so Okonkwo, who can no longer wrestle, who can no longer kill, who can no longer do the things that he's used to, decides to take his own life as his final protest. I feel that that figure of a hanging body is more or less the vibrant figure of modern subjects, or modern subjecthood or modern subjectivity, that we are dissociated from other places of power, and we have been incarcerated in a very tight bubble where the only way we can understand what is happening in the world, where we can, belong to each other, is by condemning each other, is by enacting retributive, punitive measures, is by thinking of power as so impoverished that it is isolated in the city hall. And so we struggle for in this scarce space. This, the story of Baldur, the Norse mythology, the god who is immune from death and dying, and is suddenly incarcerated from all of life. I feel this is a metaphor, if you will, for whiteness itself. Whiteness being this planetary ethic that enlists different kinds of bodies into itself for the purpose of flattening the world and making it safe for the individual, discrete, separate, and dissociated self to thrive in rational bureaucratic systems. That feels like a way to think about whiteness for me. Not just white identified bodies, which can very rapidly be avatars of whiteness, but whiteness as a planetary ethic, as an earth-shaping phenomenon. That seems to be the context of activism today. This impoverished place of power where we can only draw from the resources of our incarceration to address power. Yeah, I'll stop there for now.
So I think what I find really heartening is that you bring a narrative of white supremacy that is, I think, more generative and inclusive. I think that the narrative of white supremacy that is dominant in social justice circles is, a very divisive. There are people who are white, they are problematic, and if only they got over their fragility and became aware of the ways in which interpersonally they perpetuate bias, and politically they kind of tacitly support institutions that perpetuate bias. If only they were to kind of come to their senses, atone and change and become explicitly anti-racist, that the world would be a better place. And there is, of course, layers and layers of truth and validity in that. But
Yeah.
fundamentally, it is a group of people, telling another group of people who majoritarily don't feel very empowered. They don't feel very supreme. They don't, they don't feel like they are in the ascendancy or the master race. So they're problematic, and what they need to do is to change. And it pits, I think, white groups against everyone else, and creates a climate that, okay, well, now if we're to make identity politics a thing and make white identity problematic, it's naturally going to give rise to a politics of white identity. And it feels that in a way, it is creating and strengthening and furthering the very thing that it's trying to resist.
Yes.
That's I think one aspect that I'd love your more reflections from you on is, how do we name, oppressive dynamics, or if certain groups of people are behaving, thinking, acting in particular ways that are problematic, without locking ourselves into a us and them dynamic that is really only going to entrench defensiveness and even give rise to a kind of a counter defense by supporting people who, even more strongly advocate for their rights. So I'm curious to know how we can do both of those things.
Well, there are certain ideas that are electrifying and magnetic in the structure, the architecture of cancel culture. One of them is humanism. When many people hear humanism, they hear something good: human values, human rights. By humanism, I mean the constellation of ideologies, philosophies, concepts, ideas, discussions that are premised on the idea of the human being the central fulcrum of agency, intelligence, and change in the universe. It's anthropocentrism. It's the idea that Ronan, or, and me, the human, is where everything meets, and everything else, in contrast, is dead. Nature is dead. It's mute. It's useless unless we impose meaning on it. In this space, identity, since the world outside anyway is dead and is empty and void, everything that we should normally, I don't want to use the word normally, or everything that we would properly associate with the context that we're entangled with is localized in the human form. That is, we are part of a world that is unmasterable, that is replete with unmasterable affect and feelings, agonistic forces and currents. Humanism takes all of that and situates it in and locks it into the human form, and says, this is everything we should be focusing on. And that's where identity sprouts from. Identitarian politics is basically the idea of not just belonging and seeking power by associating ourselves with those that we feel we belong to, but also it's a driving further of this notion of humanism, that we're the only ones we can count on, that the world outside is dead, that ethics is the human, and everything that is good and beautiful and valuable about the world is located in the human. And that is problematic for many reasons. One of which is, if we do that, then we risk seeing the person. We risk mistaking the conditions for the things that are conditioned. We risk seeing an atom, in the place of the forest. We would take Ronan, for instance, if he said something that was inappropriate. And forgetting that you are conditioned and framed in a world that is larger than you, that exceeds you, where forces are always acting upon you in transcorporeal trafficking, molecularly changing your body. We forget all of that. And so we just we pixelate you, in a sense. We kind of pixelate you. And then in doing that, the only way we can respond to you, the only way we can ask the question, how do we respond? The question you just asked now. How do we become accountable to grievous things? How do we show responsibility for the things that are painful, suffering around the world? The only way we can do that is to eliminate, is to cut out the atom, because we've reduced it in some very reductionistic fashion. We've reduced it to the human. The only way we can do that is to get rid of you, or to get rid of the pixel that is disturbing the frame of innocence, or the cult of oblivion that we would call white modernity. And that seems to me to be part of the reasons why it's cancel culture is occupying even vaster territory today. It seems to me to be the interaction. I'm using the word of Karen Barad, not just interaction, because the world is made up of relationships, not of things that relate. It seems to me to be the interaction between humanism, technological advancement in the proliferation of social networks, and modern despair. Now, these three things, among many other things in a constellation of other considerations, interact to create an arena of poverty, where the only way we can see ourselves is through categories of thought that has been labeled this identity or the other identity. You're either Black or you're white or you're this or you're that. The idea that we spill through each other is scandalous to modernity. I mean, modernity could tolerate difference, but it cannot tolerate the idea that is being glimpsed in DNA ancestry tests, I think. The idea that I am more than the identity that I've been boxed into. And so the only resource that humanism can offer to the questions that you're asking is kill the atom, get rid of it, destroy it. There's no other way to go. I could speak, allow me for a moment to use computer terms, computer terminology. Let me call it the concept of pixelation, shall we? Let's play here. That within a system, within a grid making um, computer program, if you will, composed of bytes, little bytes, everything in its place, like a Lego land or Lego universe. The only two things to do is, or the only two kinds of actions that are possible are defragmentation and fragmentation. That is, fragmentations are events when those bytes or those pieces of information fall apart and spill. And defragmentation is when they come together, when the system brings them back together and makes them visible to the system, if you will, makes them utilizable, instrumental to the system's progress. I think pixelation, the idea that we're pixelated means we cannot meet each other. We're stuck in our egoic incarceration. The only way to go is either to fall apart, which is not exactly exciting, or to come together into prison, which is not exciting either. We're pixelated, and maybe that's a problem there.
So what I'm hearing from you is that, you know, each individual is the summation of a historical, co-created collective process of matter and energy, and to reify that expression as a low residue thumbnail image of their actual group identity, their skin color, is to massively reduce the complexity of who they are and the situation, the context that we're in. And I really love that honoring of the full complexity. If anything, it just brings more common humanity, that we share much more than, you know, our identities might lead us to believe. But it also yields a lot more compassion as to how the individual has wound up thinking, feeling, and acting in that way. One of the ironies of identity politics is that it strips away the rich individuality that we all have, the life story that we all have, wounding and trauma and suffering, and it puts us into a box that says, you know, Ronan, you're a white, cisgendered, Western European man. And it doesn't take in, and yes, and to all the privileges that come with that, but also misses the richness behind that, that even if it didn't have any intrinsic value to the debate, that there's something dehumanizing about that. And, and the spillover effect that has in terms of the division it creates between us. I think that, you know, for me, walking into a room of different ethnicities, I sense a kind of a palpable undertone of mutual suspicion, fear. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to act incorrectly. And there's this. You can feel at best a constipation, and at worst a kind of a mild fear or terror that people will say the wrong thing, and it takes away just the innocence of human interaction, of exchange, and at the same time, I'm holding, you know, the contribution of critical race theory, of intersectionality, that there are certain groups in society that are systematically disadvantaged, and we need a politics that can locate and describe that process so that we can correct it. And so it does have an important function. And so I'm wondering, how do you marry the contribution of, let's say, intersectionality that wants to pinpoint injustice by, you know, crudely defining people by groups? And how can we marry that with what I'm hearing from you, which is a kind of a richer understanding of who we are?
First, let me respond to all of that by repeating this Indian proverb. Name the color, blind the eye. Name the color, blind the eye. And I think the deep invitation there is that seeing is political and naming is risky. Once you start to name things, you risk losing sight of them, right? If I'm able to locate in some spectral continuum a color, if I'm able to say this is what this color is, I'm abstracting the color from its ongoingness, its becomingness, if you will. I'm making it a thing, in some process of thingification. Maybe in some remote time, in the deep past, we needed, and by we, I mean to create some specificity here and not overgeneralize, but the people that would evolve to be humans needed some protection from the swirl and the chaos of nature, right? And in doing that, they closed shop, if you will. They stopped being roaming species and they became sedentary, and they created civilization, and they created rational bureaucratic systems in order to protect and to create this idea and concept of safety, you know, goaded on and instigated by the stability of climate forces as well. I have compassion for all of this because I refuse to see the world within the binary of good versus evil, right? Once you take away that label, then you see other interesting things, and you can ask interesting questions. So naming the color, blinding the eye, we risk not seeing things. And modernity's greatest work, what it proliferates is names and labels and individuation, processes of individuation that are supposedly acts of cutting you away from the world and liberating you. The name is freedom there. You're free to become anything you want to be. But like Latour would say, we've never actually been human in that sense. We've always been connected with the wilds, with the depths. But you want to say something? I'm going to ask you. Wait, you want to respond?
Well, I was just going to say that it really, you know, it reminds me that true freedom is being an intimate participant in the living process of your becoming.
Yeah.
And we live in a world that reifies us into static concepts and identities. And I think that what identity politics does is then adds a shameful and punitive element to that. So it's not just that I am, as a living being in the process of becoming, actually a categorized, white, cisgendered, etc., etc. It's that the tweet that I wrote 4 years ago, the picture of me at the party in a fancy dress, the person that I was associated with as a speaker at a conference, all of those things reify me in ways that are problematic and create both a sense of kind of collective sanction. And so I think that what I'm hearing from you that really hasn't been named is the degree to which identity politics is a regime that almost puts that process of modernity, that making human beings into static entities, it almost furthers that imprisonment because it this layer of division between static concepts, a sense of shame about being a certain static concept, and punishment for being that. You know, the image that comes to mind is Foucault's panopticon, the idea of the prison in which the observatory has blinds closed, so you never know whether you're being watched or not. And so what I think that with the advent of social media, people are having a really visceral experience of what it's like to be a politician, an actual mainstream national politician, where everything they say and do and walk and talk is observed and could be seized upon by someone who has never met them and doesn't understand them. And so only to underscore actually and to surface the level of fear that is saturating our public lives.
Well said, brother. This is how I would then reframe cancel culture in the light of our conversation. It's carceral politics. It's mutual incarceration. And this speaks to, I mean, Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectional theory was a way of responding to power. Except that if you respond to power, you run the risk of becoming the power that you're responding to, right? Intersectional theory is about framing the experiences of the Black woman and saying the Black woman's experiences count as well. You know, see me within this space. My life matters, right? And that's a beautiful thing to say. Like you said, there's fidelity there and there's power there. I'm Black myself, right? And I want to be seen, except that who's doing the seeing here? Who's noticing who? I think once you frame your emancipation within the epistemology of your oppression, you run the risk of repeating your incarceration or reinforcing that condition of your imprisonment. And I think intersectional theory has only led further into the proliferation of more identity politics, more grid-like formations, more prisons. And we're locked into this position together. A politics of visibility locks us in. And I've recently been theorizing about that. And one of the features of identity politics, for instance, is what I call tricarcerality. And the only way I can demonstrate that is to be very, very handsy here. In the book, Things Fall Apart, the wrestler locks, it's a book about wrestling because Okonkwo, the protagonist, is a wrestler. Think about the claims of target groups, non-dominant groups, when they stake their claims to power and say, look at us as well, our lives matter. Their claims is to, their work is to stake those claims or to put those claims at the feet of power and say, look at me, I will not be looked through, I will not be dismissed, I also matter. But to do that, I need to fix the person's gaze. I need to hold the person and lock the person into position. And not just do that, I need to hold my feet firm on the ground, if you will, so that I'm not only locking the person into a particular stance, and that's where maybe white allyship comes in. And I think a lot of white allyship becomes performative righteousness, where people just want to say the right things to get along. They're afraid of being shamed. And it's all righteousness politics. It's all about representation. And it's all about people going into this pyramidal scheme of power. Well, back to my figure again, where I lock you into position and I say, look at me. My victimhood becomes a form of power, right? And I lock the conditions that frame our incarceration into being as well by digging my feet into the ground, or at least it's an attempt to do that. So that in a sense, I'm locked, I'm incarcerated. By locking you as well, I'm incarcerating you, I'm incarcerating myself, and I'm holding whiteness, the very condition that locks us all in. I'm holding it into space. I'm locking it down. I'm hoping it stays still. I'm stabilizing the conditions of my incarceration and hoping it goes away, ironically, at the same time. So that this is what I call tricarcerality. We're locked into certain positions that does not allow for transformation. The only way that I can hold you into account is to again incarcerate you by saying that you're evil or you're good. It's either a binary position. There's no allowance for you to spill and to become something else. There's no allowance for you to be forgiven, to change, to learn from your mistakes, to ask new questions. There's no space for compassion. There's no space for a falling apart because, again, you're atomistic. You're a Cartesian principle. I see you the way the modern era has invited me and conditioned me to see you. But there's no movement there then, brother. You see, we're locked into this place together. If we depend solely on intersectional theory, identity politics, then we are going to be locked into this place of power. We need a wormhole event that might help us secrete ourselves into fugitive spaces, and then we can perform other ways of power, other ways of noticing ourselves in relation with the world.
Thank you for that. So going back to my original question, how do we draw attention to groups of people who are systematically oppressed in the system. So whether that be exclusion from universities, or higher rates of police brutality, or segregation in urban planning, whatever it might be, without locking them into that static position of being the victim that can't transform. Is there again, I'm trying to find a way of marrying the intentions of intersectionality with what I'm hearing from is a different starting point that actually releases us from this tricarceration.
I want to hold it in some with some tension. On one hand, a politics of visibility, which is part of the constellation, the universe of identity politics and gaining power. And the only way that this can understand power is in diversity or representational politics, getting me a seat at the table. And on the other hand, I want to hold a politics of fugitivity, a politics of post-humanism, a politics of what Deleuze would call imperceptibility, that is becoming animal. I've read authors who have spoken about my traditions as the aim and the ultimate goal of intersectional theory. That intersectional theory tries to invite justice based on certain modern parameters of what justice could look like. But again, as James Hillman would say, what the client recommends as a solution to his or her problem is actually symptomatic of that syndrome or that problem. So it seems we're repeating ourselves again by trying to frame justice on identity politics or redistributive economics or on mediated communitarianism. It seems all of these patterns don't work. What we need to work is a space of fugitivity. And what does that look like? I think it looks like, well, there are many ways that I'll describe it: leaving the plantation behind, becoming woman, as Deleuze would describe it, becoming human, becoming animal rather, not becoming human, leaving, going underground and seeing practices where we can open up other spaces of being with each other, naming grief. I don't think there's a holistic system that can allow us to summarily respond to these issues, but there are modest ways we can name and stay with the trouble of our complicity or comorbidity with whiteness. Again, let me bring that picture to mind. Whiteness is this flattening of the earth. But I think whiteness also gets exhausted. And over time, it weakens in certain places. It grows wounds, dehiscences, and then those wounds become ruptures. Those are the places I feel we're being invited to go to. What do I mean by ruptures? I feel that the places that are rupturing are the places that white modernity has medicalized, pathologized, named as scandalous, or just pushed out of the frame of intelligibility. I feel those are the places we need to go to frame a post-human politics of becoming, a weird politics that might allow us, to ask new questions. For me, that means making sanctuary. My theoretical orientation here is about making sanctuary, that we're being called to become monsters. I don't mean monsters in the Hollywoodized negative form here of King Kong or something. I mean monsters in form of losing shape. And how do we lose shape? It's not singularly something that Ronan can do by holding space during Zoom calls. It's not something the psychedelic society can unilaterally do. It takes the invisible entourage of the world and ancestrality working with us. It comes up in different ways. Psychedelics, it comes up in different ways, holding space for grief. It comes up for me personally in not schooling my child. That might be shocking to some people, but unschooling here, localized here, contextually intelligible here, is our way of addressing colonial systems, imperial ways of making sense of the world. It's not just not sending children to school, and I'm a professor, a recovering psychologist, but it's about listening to our children, treating them as elders that have come, returned to deplete the human, to stress the human just a little bit more so that other forms of being alive in the planet can surge. It's about holding space for the insurgency of the invisible. And for me, all those metaphors mean being with my daughter and my son and treating them as philosophers in their own right, listening to the questions like the one my daughter just asked me a while ago: where does shit come from? um, and then following that where it leads. I think those are the fugitive pathways outside of the territory of the anthropos, of the human. And the human, again, is again, just to centralize this, to emphasize this, the human is the territory of whiteness. The human is what people like myself have been denied access to. We've been denied access into the human. And I'm saying maybe we don't need to gain access into the human anymore. Maybe we don't need to perform a politics of visibility. Maybe what we need right now is to leave the plantation behind, is to walk out, and go into those cracks in the modern, in the body and the flesh of whiteness, and perform the scandalous work of becoming animal. And it to take a longer time to stress out or to pull out or tease out what becoming animal might entail. But it's always modest post-human work. It involves listening. It involves talking to stuff like bacteria. It involves mingling with furniture as if they were alive. It is phenomenological. It is non-anthropocentric. It is powerful.
And what I hear again and again in what you're speaking is a politics of spontaneity, that actually the truly intelligent move will emerge from within us, an expression of an intelligence that is much deeper than anything we can think or suppose, and that therein is a pathway to freedom that exists in every moment, and in every moment to transform the frame. I do problematic. Someone who is versed in woke politics will tell me that's an issue. I'll get defensive, and all of a sudden we're in a rigid dynamic based on masks that we put on each other's face. And what I hear from you is something much deeper. It's a liberation that goes beyond any particular justice movement of today. It's an entirely different frame of politics altogether, and it's one that's
So if I cancel culture, I think I'm proliferating it. I'm expanding it. I don't want to cancel culture. I don't want to dismiss it. I want to have compassion for it. And how do I exercise compassion for cancel culture? By refusing to give it its own medicine. The medicine of cancel culture is to say everything is either this or that. It's the Socratic law of the excluded middle, right? You're either this or that. I want to tell cancel culture, no, there's a whole monstrous messianic middle here that you're missing. And if only you give attention to that, then you are not evil or good. You're not either one or the other. You're embodied, you're entangled with things around you. So my refusal is fugitive. I'm walking away from the proliferation of certain forms of knowledge. I'm not going to say cancel culture is bad, let's get rid of it. I want to bring it down to earth. I want to let it fall. I want to let it compost. And by doing that, you want to say something.
Well,
your mouth open.
Only to say that I think you're speaking to something very subtle that I think all of us, especially I imagine people on this webinar and watching it, are complicit in, which is there's woke activism, and then there's this new group forming who are meta woke. So they have come to see the problems of woke activism and are able to kind of identify its blind spots, but in doing so form a new tribe that is bonded in its disgust of a problematic group. And I have to have Rich, who's on tech support for the meta woke framing. But it really, I'm noticing that how much this feeds my ego to be able to find a group of people to roll my eyes with at woke activism and say, go, like, when are they going to grow up? It's so immature, it's so ridiculous. And it's meeting this deep need I have for, well, at least I have some allies that see the world as I do. And that leads me into another inquiry for our conversation. One of the more compelling things I've read about cancel culture, woke activism, is that it is offering us a simulacrum of religion,
Yeah.
in an age that has lost meaning
Yeah.
in the atomistic void.
Yeah.
Um, and if you analyze the dynamics of it, there's a very much a creation myth where there was a time when things were good. Usually, it's a kind of a pre-colonial, romanticized indigeneity.
Mm-hmm.
Colonialism came along as an evil, and whiteness came along as an evil, and ruined everything. And now there is a clear cause, which is to end white supremacy and to uproot an evil that lives in all of us. And of course, that really mimics the idea of original sin in Christianity, that the white person
Yeah.
kind of owns up and atones for their problematic identity and basically is engaged in performative rituals to show that they are pure. And then that the group itself have an idea of what purity looked like, which is a world that where all problematic language, problematic behavior is removed and will basically police that space. And if
Yeah.
there's anyone that from within that tribe that questions those features, the dogma, they are excommunicated, they are
Yeah.
ejected from the tribe. Um, and so there's two aspects that I'd love your thoughts on. One is, what are the deep longings that assimilated religion like that is meeting? Um, and and the second is, what shadow dynamics is it also playing to? So I see in identity politics a deep-seated need for revenge, um, uh, an almost sycophantic desire to be the victim in perpetuity, and and a real desire for power, but one that you can excuse because you're on the side of the powerless. And often when I encounter the kind of the zealots of identity politics, I see a lot of unintegrated hate, raw, pure hate that comes from deep wounding. And it's a hidden feature of the conversation is the hate and those shadow dynamics and this deep longing for belonging, I suppose, ultimately. So I wonder
Yeah.
whether if the expression of identity politics is the iceberg and underneath the water is this big psyche, I wonder if you could maybe take us on a tour of what you see that psyche as being.
Um, so you've perfectly described the Freudian structure of consciousness, um, the tip of the iceberg and the submerged iceberg. Um, and I'm sure many people would know, or at least some people might know, that Freud's intentions, situating consciousness or psyche as a structure that is um, fashioned in terms of the ego, being on top, the conscious one, and the unconscious, the id, the unconquerable. Freud's imperial vocation was to find a way to frame therapy as the progressive gentrification, the psychic gentrification of the swamp of consciousness, the dirty, murky lands of consciousness, the places where we have feelings and shadows and stuff like that, that we don't get to share, the shame we stuff in there. Freud wanted to expand the ego, to such an extent that it has rational control over this swampland. And then James Hillman comes along, who many consider the founder of archetypal psychology, and says maybe this psychic gentrification is problematic. Maybe if you try to drag people to become citizens of the ego, then we're losing an aspect of the world that is always there. We're losing our in touchness with shadows, which we will never become masters of. We're framing the self as citizens in this regime of light, in this regime of pure light, that is also another form of speaking about identity. What can be seen, what can be named, what is intelligible. And that seems to me to be the problem here. To gain power within a system that frames itself as the repudiation of darkness, one has to appear pure and light and seen and visible. And so to do that successfully, one has to repress shadows. But the dynamic of repressing shadows here is ironic, because the more you do your best to press down the things that are haunting, the more you take on the monstrous forms of the things that you're resisting, you know, the things that you do not want to bear out, you know, to show form, to show face. And so it seems like identity politics is not only resistance against oppression, it's resistance against, again, what I talked about, tricarcerality, against the more, I was about, you know, orcs in the Lord of the Rings, you know, the monstrous forms, the hordes of beasts and shadows that threaten to overtake our place. And so it's about keeping them down, if you will.
And I'm reminded of a quote from Osho that, you know, despite our best intentions to manage other people's perception, we are always broadcasting what's really animating us: the insecurity, the shadows, the drives, the desires.
Yeah.
I feel that, you know, there's lots of analysis as to why the left is losing, or why mainstream feels alienated from it.
Yeah.
I think in one sense, cancel culture is the kind of the extreme allergy of, like, you know, to stop completely policing who I am and what I can say and what I can do. You know, it's 62% of Americans in the latest poll that I read from the Cato Institute feel they can't share their political views in the current political climate, for, you know, the fear that they will be taken down. But I feel that actually, I think that one of the reasons why the left isn't succeeding in kind of bringing more people on board is that people sense that it's not being honest about the scandalous nature of what it actually means to be a human. They don't buy the purity, and somehow the right own their depravity and their you know, their deplorability more. You know, there was a key turning point when, you know, Hillary Clinton called Trump supporters deplorables, and they put it on their t-shirt and said, "Of course, I am a deplorable." You know, and I think there's a process that needs to happen where the left, and I see the left very broadly, needs to own its shit. It needs to own the shit that sits underneath it, and actually, ironically, find its true power. The true power that happens when you own the absolute hatred that lives inside you, the relishing in being a victim. And I think what we lack in that polite, pure light society are spaces to be that deranged human, and to allow that part of us to speak. And maybe even the riots that we're seeing in America is the shadow that's being kept indoors, both psychically and literally, during COVID, just coming out, even if it's for a just cause.
Yeah. I would frame, I wouldn't say though that the right owns their shit though. Um, I think they're struggling with, um, in fact, one could even frame it as the extremity of like swinging a pendulum between two polarities, but it's still in the same grandfather's clock. You know, they're struggling within a regime of light for space, for power, for visibility. Um, and on the right, it's probably an escape from the materiality of their conditions. And on the left, it seems to be an escape into language, into performance, into labels, um, uh, and that being conceived as power or purity. And like you rightly say, there's this fugitive underground world that is bursting out and that is urging or falling apart, that will sometimes show up as a trickster that basically says, no, this isn't about good or evil or the left or the right. A different kind of politics wants to happen here, and this kind of politics may not be may not find itself expressed in terms of representation. May not find itself expressed in terms of how many Black people sit at the table. A brief story: teaching at Schumacher College in the UK, I travel a lot, or I used to, in a different world the pandemic inflected one we're in right now. And I would teach in Schumacher, and one day I was telling the story of my experiences as a traveler. Now, because of the color of my skin, I feel that I'm usually more than once drawn apart for on suspicious grounds, more often than usual. I'm taken aside for secondary processing. Um, and sometimes I have to hide my passport, uh, so that people don't know that I come from Nigeria. Um, and so this is my experience traveling. Um, and I remember sharing this with my students, the cohort in Schumacher. And a white German guy, friend, came to me and said, I'm sorry for your experience. I'm really sorry that you have to go through this. I just walk into a room and that's it. I breeze through the airport, but you have to stay hours upon hours, in the airport. And I don't have these experiences like you do. And I just wanted to apologize on behalf of us. And I remember saying to him, I reject your apology. And it was like, oh, I'm sorry. What did I say wrong? What did I do? I'm really sorry. Did I say anything wrong? That anxiety about saying something wrong. And I said to him, I'm not rejecting because he said you didn't frame it right. I'm not part of that script making enterprise. I'm rejecting it because if I give into this idea, if I accepted your apology, I would be accepting the idea that there is only one place of power. So what I'm rejecting is your thesis that I have to be accepted at your table, that there is only one room actually to occupy. The house is large. There are other ways of being in the world. I may not be able to breeze through airports, but do you know how to hear from your ancestor? Do you know how to consult with spirit animals? Do you know how to listen to a plant? Do you know how to share colors with the wind? I'm going Pocahontas there. Do you know how to do any of these things, to dance with fire? Do you have gift cultures where you share your feelings of jealousy? So I reject this idea that power has to congeal in a modern bureaucratic space. I have disadvantages in this system, but it's not the only framing of power that I'm committed to.
Yeah.
So in a spirit of brotherly entanglement, I reject that apology.
I think it's also a rejection of the noble victim that's often put on marginalized groups, where on one level there's this kind of respect afforded and this conciliatory tone, but it locks them in a position, and it's just very refreshing for someone to say, I don't accept this noble victim that you're placing on me. I choose to see myself in a much more emancipatory way. I suppose again and again, I see in you someone who is choosing the most liberating understanding of who they are. And I think that that's missing in all sides of the debate, whether you're the perpetrator or the victim in an identity politics debate, is this internal capacity to see yourself in the most liberating and empowering way.
I think I think when we're framed within certain spaces of power, we will respond to the architecture of the space, the ecological affect of the space, and we will mount up walls of resistance, trying to put our issues before the powers that be. But I want to recall words from Fred Moulton, the author of The Undercommons, for instance, when he says, one does not speak truth to power. That seems scandalous, to say. One does not speak truth to power is basically inviting me to consider that power is not as powerful as we think it is. That there are other ways of framing power and imagining being in the world. So I want to be able to frame walkout cultures, not to walk out in terms of gaining some sense of purity and not acknowledging my comorbidity with modernity already, and not even acknowledging, some of us who have, in Africa, for instance, we struggled for independence, and we learned the hard way that when we won, we lost the game, because even in winning and taking freedom and independence for ourselves, we were already doing that within the epistemology of our oppression. We needed something more than independence to be truly free. And so this is a take on activism today, that if activism is entirely premised on the binary options of victory versus defeat, then we risk being immured, or we risk being locked in processes of power that might reiterate and reinforce the very conditions we're trying to escape. We need a politics of fugitivity, a project of leaving behind and walking away, a politics of refusal, leaving behind those spaces of power. And in other ways, finding ways to name ourselves, that is not premised on the specter of identity, which worked well within modernity, but only worked, I think, to form new and problematic categories that never meet each other, that are never entangled, that are never falling into each other and never doing anything new. I'm looking for the exquisite. And the only way to do that, the rare, the unsaid, the unintelligible, the unthought, the only way to do that is to find the messianic monstrosity of the missing middle, the middle that modernity does not know how to articulate.
The messianic monstrosity of the missing middle. So speaking of that, I think it would be a good time to open this up to people who are on the call. So if you're on the call, there is a button that says Q&A, and you can type in a question that you have for myself or Bayo. People have questions already, so you can also vote on the ones that you think really need to be asked, because we won't really get a chance to get to them all. And my recommendation is, if you can try and frame your question in one sentence or two sentences, because it's difficult for everyone to read through paragraph questions. So I'm just going to give everyone maybe a couple of minutes just to read through the questions, upvote the ones that you feel are really need to be explored, and also obviously write some more questions yourself. While we're doing that, Rich, do you want to come out from behind the banner of the Psychedelic Society? So Rich is helping with the tech support tonight, but also is hugely knowledgeable about identity politics and this whole question. So I would love, while I get my charger to charge my laptop, if you could give a little half-time analysis of what you've heard, what you think might be missing, and you've an invitation, at least from me, to to be critical and to say where you feel the conversation might not be going fully into yet, so that we can make sure it's juicy for the second half. And I am listening. I'm just getting my charger.
Very good. I'm enjoying this feeling of being off the edge of my script and not knowing what I'm supposed to be doing here. What I notice is the moments in the conversation where I feel really drawn in, when I feel most pulled in. And there's one current, which is my intellectual self, which notices these references to specific thinkers in books. And I'm like, yes, and virtually high-fiving. I'm like on the edge of my seat. But there's another one, which I think is maybe more alive, more animal, which is, there are these moments where I feel my whole body come alive by what one or the other of you is saying, and it usually is when the conversation steps out of the abstract and into the body and into specific stories about specific people. I mean, even that first gesture you made, Bayo, of showing gratitude and being appreciative of the people holding the space. I felt like you were calling us into our entanglement and noticing, hey, we have relationship here. Like, this invisible person called tech support is another human, and I acknowledge him. And that tradition comes from a place and from a group of people. So I guess my curiosity is for more of this entanglement, more collisions between our bodies. If there's a way, if there's some way that we can get more of the embodied sensation into the room, more of the verbs and less of the nouns, that would make me a very enthusiastic listener for the second half.
Thanks, Rich. Okay, well, let's do that. I'm wondering, there's two questions, one from Julio and one from anonymous attendee. Is it possible we'll start with Julio, for Julio to be brought in as a panelist so we can ask this as himself rather than his text. Is that possible, Rich, to do that?
Yeah, I'm trying. Let's see. Allow to talk.
If you're comfortable, maybe you want to stay anonymous, but the invitation is there as well, because I think we can then feel the meaning behind your question and feel more of you as well. So Julio, are you there? And if not, I can maybe start with anonymous attendee who I'm assuming wants to remain anonymous. So I'll start with the second question. Julio, you're there.
Yep.
So if you just want to take yourself off mute.
Yeah.
So yeah, just be, if you want to just restate your question.
Yeah, I'm looking over it again, but I could just ask it just straight. What's the role of trauma in marginalised groups reproducing the same divisions of identity which were imposed on them by categorization, which I frame as the start of the scientific revolution, which led to the idea of white supremacy, which is separating human beings into various identities. So in a way, many marginalized groups are kind of seem to be reproducing those same divisions. And how do you deal with that trauma? How do you, without re-traumatizing?
Right.
That and who does that and where, you know, because obviously it can happen within the identities, but it's harder when it's outside. So I couldn't tell someone, a trans person or a gay person, or if I'm from a different group, that may re-traumatize, and I've seen that happen. So how do we collectively acknowledge the trauma and acknowledge the fact that we're living within this categorized, continually increasingly categorized model of reality?
Right. Thank you, brother. The way I'll respond to that is to say that maybe we need to embark on a cartographical project that allows trauma to be seen as a gift on its own, going to wherever it may lead. I think one of the categorical mistakes of modernity as well is to see trauma as individuated. It's my trauma versus your trauma. And I know we speak about intergenerational trauma, so it's shared. But this idea that it's a human thing, again, that it's centrally human, and that it's not just, it's not an assemblage. I'm using the word, Deleuzian concept of an assemblage. It's not furniture around us. It's not trees, that ecologies are not traumatized. It's humans that are traumatized, you know. I think that repeats this or deepens the trauma, because again, we're locked into practices that seek to close up the trauma or to get rid of it while not recognizing the conditions that make it possible. So let me use Gabor Mate's concept and say trauma could be a gift. It's a paradigmatic opening. It comes with its own world. But if you try to heal it, like to cut it off, to sever it from its work, then we're locked again, and then we're stuck. Let me put it in very, very practical terms, if I can. That I know people in my country that have a sense of loss about, you know, British colonization. They've lost their language. I grew up not speaking my language. I was trained to speak English when a teacher dragged out a television screen and said, approximate the BBC presenter and make sure your English is just as pristine as his. We learn to speak that way. And so we internalize the sense of inferiority. We learn to see ourselves as inadequate. And now we're locked in that position because we see ourselves as, we see trauma as a humanocentric concept. We forget that the systems that trauma creates also reinforces trauma. It circles back on us. And so most of the things we're doing to take care of our feelings of inadequacy are very psychological. I'm a trained psychologist. I'm a recovering one. There are many people that cater to people who report or present with symptoms, present with feelings of failure, feelings of not being enough. We proliferated all that. We tasked the Ministry of Health to create more bed spaces so that people who report like this can be taken care of. But we did nothing about the conditions that make trauma possible. It's all human. It's all anthropocentric. I think a post-human, inhumane, or non-human notion of trauma would allow us to notice that it is not singularly about us. It's not even about fixing trauma. It's about allowing trauma to shape-shift us. What kind of politics would allow us to follow trauma where it might lead, to embark on processes that might help us touch our bodies, touch where it hurts, and share it with the world around us, share it in circles, share it in rituals and rites of passage? What kinds of processes might allow that? That is the question of the moment for me.
Thanks, Bayo. I would just add to that, that often, you know, in terms of identities, people who have really experienced trauma and have processed it find such a deep commonality with the self that emerges from that process, and find it in people who have been through a similar process. And I do think that there is, you know, there's a story of trauma where, you know, let's say white and black people are trying to process intergenerational trauma that they've been, you know, that one side is inflicted on the other, and it just ends up being a shit show. Like Resme Meneken, the psychologist who does intergenerational racialized trauma, would always recommend that whites and blacks do it separately, because if you try and bring people together too early, it just ends up being deeply traumatizing and bringing people back to square one. But I do also think that there is a particular self that emerges from really reckoning with your trauma, where you can see a true brother and sister in the person that's been through that. And so I think that that's a great asset and a great resource in reconstituting ourselves and reconnecting ourselves together. Thanks, Julio. I'm gonna, just in the interest of time, try and get to some more questions. I'm gonna read this from anonymous attendee. So, how do you propose the most oppressed in our society, often Black women, demand to be seen and heard without utilizing the dominant epistemological mode of communication? Example, binary language of right and wrong, good and bad. Perhaps art and poetry? So many women don't want to seat at the table of the powerful because we do not wish to shrink and conform ourselves in order to engage in oppressive capitalist modes of production. But is this the only place we can influence change?
I was in Brazil last year, and I was in the most interesting place in Brazil, the favelas. That is where I witness, and I use the word witness, not just witness, because it affected me, and I was seen in that process, just as I was invited to see the process. I saw people that were engaging in fugitive forms of production. Favelas are usually conceived, especially to developmental bureaucrats, as places that need work, need development. And I'm not trying to romanticize a favela. It has its shadows and it has its issues. But within those spaces, wastelands, you know, surrounding the pristineness of the city, I saw people and I witnessed people doing stuff with waste and doing things with discarded food that I'd never seen before. Like a lady teaching others in the favela not to throw away the peel of an orange, but to convert it into detergent, and thus liberate themselves from having to go to the shopping mall with money they don't have, or having to steal to even get detergent. I find in that some kind of supplementary politics that is not supposed to be an either or situation, an exclusionary dynamic that says we shouldn't fight. We shouldn't fight the powers that be. That when resistance is called for, we shouldn't mount up a politics of recognition. We will need to do that. We're embodied, we're situated. We will need to do that sometimes. But the risk of doing that is what I try to emphasize, that in doing that over and over again, we risk entangling ourselves indefinitely in the very conditions that created our oppression. So we need a different kind of politics, maybe running alongside in the same way. a different kind of politics that allows us to depart, an exodus, an exile, to remake ourselves, to remake our relationship with ourselves and with our planet, in terms of waste, in terms of how we think about education, in terms of how we think about science and all of that. And so I never framed this as an either or position, or that let's do away with schooling or let's do away with the politics of recognition. We will need visibility, but we cannot entirely frame justice on intersubjectivity. We cannot frame politics on only being seen. As the Chinese will say, may you be seen by the emperor. And they meant that as a curse. That is, if you risk being seen by the emperor, you will lose your place of power. So I, as a so-called citizen of the so-called global South, I come with my own lessons and questions. And my question is, if I continue to frame my justice or my emancipation within the systems that were left for me by oppression, by oppressive standards, then I risk being a prisoner there. I want to see where Blackness could go other than just getting locked in the system. Where else can Blackness go? What else can my body do other than just proliferate the familiar?
So I feel like that was in part an answer to Sarah's question. Question from Tiffany: how to be both fugitive and anti-racist simultaneously? Is this possible?
I resist naming. This is going to be scandalous. My notion of racism is not identitarian or humanocentric. Of the racist, my epistemology or ontology of the racist takes into consideration the assemblage, not the human that is part of the assemblage. I want to take into consideration the network of bodies that creates that affect that we might call hate, that we might call prejudice, that we might call a sense of superiority. Instead of the person, that is an atomic part of that network. So the racist to me is not the person. The racist is the assemblage. Anti-racism then takes on a queer notion in light of delusion assemblages. If we get stuck in identity boxes, then anti-racism is the proliferation of abstractions. We're just basically finding ways to nullify the individuated self. If anti-racism becomes a way of responding to the assemblage, then it becomes more than an act of resistance. It becomes even an act of compassion. It becomes a way, more than just educating them to being woke. It becomes a way of addressing the conditions that make those kinds of affect and feelings possible. So fugitivity for me is the way to do that. Fugitivity for me is noticing the world anew. It's post-humanism. It's finding ways to relate with each other and our planet in ways that defeat the identitarian boxes. I don't want to say defeat, but that compost it and put it to rest. It's exhausted. So for me, the racist is not the human. I've shared this in my class. I've been teaching archetypal psychology and the notion of the racist being more than the human. And I think that changes everything. If we see the racist not as the human, but as the network, as climatic conditions, as microbial instigations, as the kind of food we eat. Racializing assemblages is what anti-racism work has not taken into consideration.
So, and this hopefully speaks to Elizabeth's questions. Surely the in-group, out-group phenomenon is a product of ultimately resource scarcity. And obviously we have some kind of affinity for, we're all racist in the sense that we all have some kind of biological affinity or nervous system comfort with people who share our skin color, just say kind of innately biologically. And we have to kind of go through a process of socialization where we can really see each other as humans. But that is a product itself of resource scarcity, where we had to look after our tribe and protect our tribe. And And that ultimately
and create ideologies that basically say that the other is
inferior,
less than, inferior.
But
yes,
the ultimate assemblage surely is class politics. That that ultimately we have identity politics trying to address injustice in the system in a way by turning us on each other. When there is a particular group of people that are hoarding opportunities, them being rent seekers, they don't belong to a particular group, identity group. They are people who are extracting value from the system and not contributing to it. And where do you see the role of class politics in emancipation? Because on one level, it's reinforcing lots of modern notions of the static individual, one group here, the other group there. But if our energies were focused on, a redistribution of wealth to, from the rent-seeking 0.01% to the masses, maybe a lot of these identity politics questions would be at least in part resolved. And so we're trying to solve a problem, the racial expression of this problem, and getting kind of tied in knots when we could sidestep it and actually address the underlying resource scarcity that is created by rent seeking in an extractive system.
I would say that's a part of it, brother, but not. I'm very reluctant to name that as the prime mover, the first cause of it, if you will. Because even in my ontology, I refuse to notice causal dynamics or cause and effect relationships as stagnant or still or simple. It's not about cause and effect, it's about interaction. What is primitive accumulation, for instance, interacting with to create racism? I think it's interacting with climate stability. I think it's interacting with microbial activisms in our bodies that are instigating certain forms of feelings about ourselves and the other. And this might seem bizarre, but there are some researchers that are actually noticing that what we call our feelings are actually the products of other critters that are living within us. That even intelligence is also bacterial. Memory is the work of bacteria in our guts as well. Not unilaterally, of course, but intergenerational trauma is helped along by bacteria, which disappoints the notion of the human and the racist that is supposed to be essentially the human. So I wouldn't say that class politics and class dynamics is singularly the cause here, even if it may have originated as a way of controlling the masses and dividing the population and basically saying you're less than the other. And if you want to join in my pie, then you have to see yourself as supreme over the others, a way of controlling in the midst of scarcity. Even if we can say that it started that way, it has metastasized to be something different. And it's now a way of bodies becoming different. It's a way of bodies taking on new shapes, new problematic shapes that transcend redistributive economics or any other simple solution we can throw its way. So it might mean, brother, for me, it might mean attending to the aspects in a heterogeneous network that creates racializing assemblages, not just pinpointing class dynamics, not just pinpointing trauma, not just pinpointing the defunct science that created the notion of racial superiority, not just pinpointing all of these aspects, but dealing with them in modest ways and knowing that it's not entirely left to us as humans to work out our salvation, that the solutions will not come from humans, so to speak. It comes from the collective. And by the collective, I don't mean the human collective. I mean topographical shifts. Even pandemics can instigate new ways of thinking about our situation. So decolonization for me is not singularly the work of activism. It's the work of the planet. It's the work of the whole of ecology.
So when I hear you speak, I'm really inspired by this radically new notion of politics that disrupts the frames, that walks out, that's fugitive, that's spontaneous, that creates new spaces. but I can't help but feel that there's a certain folk politics element to it, that it feels like it's always small, impartial, and not unmeaningful, but it doesn't have the same power as formal politics and institutions that can, if done correctly, change millions of lives. And so
Yeah.
my question to you is, let's say the leaders of Black Lives Matters, they look at this, this discussion we've had, and they see something in your thinking that is just they need, and they appoint you as one of their key queer strange political advisors. What would you be recommending to the leaders of a movement like that to do to escape the tricarceration, to shift the dynamic, and to truly be a liberating movement?
Well, I wouldn't say it's folk politics, and I wouldn't actually deny that. I find that very interesting from a trickster's lens that you would name it that way. And maybe that's a hidden dimension that I've not noticed. So some ground statements. If I could tell you what this looks like, brother, then it has lost its power. I don't know what it looks like. I haven't been there myself. The idea is like we're perched on the accretion disk of a black hole, and we're just circling around it, and we haven't fallen into it. This is an invitation to fall. I call it fugitive incapacitation, to unlearn mastery, to unlearn colonial imperialism. And I don't know how that looks like. I don't have a political manifesto. You see, that's another claim of the surface. If you're going to tell us where to go, then give us a blueprint of how that looks like. But I don't know. I'm being invited into the dark, and the dark is not just a means to the light. You know, it has its own imperatives. I think that's where things actually grow and are stitched together. I want to be able to trust that the world has meaning, intelligence, agency, and it's inviting me into some kind of place. And I don't know what it might do to me. I'm facing a monster, a beast. And the only thing the monster can do to me, the most compassionate thing the monster can do to me, is to break my claims to exclusivity, to coherence, is to allow me to fall apart. Falling apart is not neat work. So this, as a ground statement, this is not about a politics that knows exactly where to go. It's about a politics that knows, that feels the imperative of descent, of going into the ground and doing the work of framing what might yet be. And having said that, the reason why Deleuzian politics or politics of imperceptibility hasn't caught on, because it's not amenable to the system as we know it today. I mean, it doesn't dance well and waltz well with nation states. Nation state, the way organizations, and the reason why organizations have taken on intersectional politics rapidly is because it's easy to compute. The algorithm is easy. Let's get 5 Black people and 4 white people. There you go, racial justice. But I'm looking for a sense of racial justice that is not based on modern power, that allows modern power to let go of its grip on the driver's wheel. And I don't know what that looks like. All I can say is making sanctuary, and the way that I'm conceiving it together with a vast community of allies, making sanctuary is the entry point into this cartographical project. It starts with recognizing the wounds that we have, the traumatic places that are scandalous in a modern project, and then working and experimenting with each other to go deeper into that place, to stay with the trouble of that. Our expectation, my theoretical expectation, is that staying in those kinds of places together might allow us to have new questions, might allow us to have new problems to deal with. It's not a Puritan place. It's not a place of arrival. We will not arrive intact, but it's a place where our bodies are broken apart, broken open. I'm trying to work with others to frame what this breaking open might be or might look like. What might a politics of becoming animal truly look like? That's my question. And if that's all I have, I'm going with it.
That is a beautiful place to close our time together. Bayo, what I see in your words, is an invitation to everyone on this call and everyone watching to invent that politics moment by moment. It's
Yes. Yes.
it's a politics that allows our every waking moment to be infused with transformative potential. For
Yeah.
us to choose the, to, in kind of Henri Bergson's conception, the enlivening moment, where the zest is, where the potential is, and to know that, to trust in the mystery that that's where intelligence is. And yeah, I just want to really sincerely thank you for exploding the frame of how we even talk and think about identity politics. I imagine tonight being this, familiar bullet point. This is the following ways in which it's problematic, and these are the ways in which it might need to change. And actually, what you've invited all of us into is is a new ground of being in politics, that has implications for anti-racism, but for everything and for everything beyond politics.
Yeah.
And I think it's really in keeping um, with the ego of activism, because the thing that the ego loves the most is control, is predictability, and
Yeah.
beyond that is an untamed beast, in the best sense, that can take us
Yeah.
in really transformative new directions. So yeah, I want to
Yeah.
huge thank you for your time and for your love and for your wisdom.
Let me say this quickly, brother. I think I wanted to, when you said Henry Bergson, I was like, dang it. I wish I threw in some Henry Bergson in there too. Because he's vital to some of the things he says, vital to our times. But Rancière, the French politician, speaking about politics as the disruption of the sensible.
Yeah.
That is, for me, like, politics is not what obtains normally. Politics is the messianic eruption of the sensible, of new kinds of sensibilities. And that will come in small ways. We think of politics as, large scale events and large universal events, spectacular formulations. But I think relating with my daughter is cosmic, is planting a garden and inviting others to eat the food. That is fugitive politics. It's modest. It may not be big in the scale of the nation state. It may not have any stabilizing power, but those are the dehiscences, the wounds that we're being asked to pass through. That's politics for me. Yeah.
And it reminds me of a quote that I hold very dear for the work that I do, from the French philosopher Charles Péguy: everything starts in mysticism and ends in politics. And I always, like, what you've just shared now has changed my understanding of that quote, because I previously thought that everything starts in mysticism, in the sense that we get our vision from the world by connecting to source. And then we have to go through that long, slow, arc of moral justice struggle to embed it in our reality, which is politics. But actually, what I'm unlearning and relearning in our conversation is that politics represents the end, the reification and the death of the aliveness of the mysticism. And what we find ourselves now in is a barren wasteland politically, because it's full of dead concepts and dead people. And what I see here is an ultimate invitation to enliven that, not knowing where it will lead. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you so deeply for that and for your time. And just like wishing you all the best.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.